Timothy Bentley was born in England, where he attended the King's School in Chester, a school founded by Henry VIII in 1541. He emigrated to the U.S. in 1976 and earned an MBA from CSULB. Take it away, Tim.
You could say the story started in Poland in the 1920s, when the newly recreated Poland had enemies on either side. After the First World War, there was less interest in breaking codes. The Black Chamber in the United States was done away with, and Secretary of State Stimson was supposed to have said that gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail. Now, I'm not a mathematician or an expert, but I've been fascinated by the Enigma story in Bletchley Park and how it's been estimated that they shortened the Second World War by 2 years and saved millions of lives. And I should tell you, I haven't seen The Imitation Game, although I've read articles about its inaccuracies. In the first slide, this is what we'll be talking about, what I'll be talking about. The machine itself, how it was broken, why it was so important. Nation was under attack. Britain requires a lot of its food through imports and the war material that it needed. It also includes different aspects of how it was broken, espionage and treachery, a certain amount of mathematics, which I can't say I really understand, permutation theory that Martin Rejewski did in one of the polls, and the dawning of the computer age, coupled with the personal tragedy of Alan Turing. As I just said, Britain at the time was faced with the Nazi regime taking over most of Europe, and it required food and oil and pretty much everything to keep continuing the war. One of the things that the U-boats really liked to do was do surface attack at night, perhaps within the convoy, and that way the ASDIC or sonar would be useless. In the first happy time that the Germans called it, from July 1940 to the end of from July 1940 to the end of October, 282 Allied ships were sunk off the Northwest Passages to Ireland for a total of over 1.4 million tons of merchant shipping. And then the second time occurred after Germany declared war on the United States and sent U-boats to the coast of America and the East Coast and also the Gulf of Mexico. And no blackout had been implemented. So as a result, the US ships were silhouetted beautifully and made very good targets. And from January of 1942 to about August of that year, those sunk in this period equaled roughly 1/4 of all ships sunk by U-boats during the entire Second World War. Another tragic story was about the Queen Mary. She was escorted, or supposedly escorted, by HMS Curaçao, which was a cruiser. And Queen Mary had 10,000 American soldiers on board. And there was a collision, and the Queen Mary, weighing 80,000 tons, went through the Curaçao weighing 4,000, split her right in half. And the sad thing about it, as well as that, was that the Queen Mary could not stop. So over 300 British Navy sailors died. The U-boats would, if they contacted a convoy, would send out a message and they'd form a wolf pack and attack the convoy. And the First World War, there was a German cruiser that ran aground, and the Russians who were in the war at the time seized it and seized the books which enabled the British to read German Navy signals. What Enigma is, it's an deciphering device. It takes text and, using the machine, it converts it into what could be gibberish, what's called frequency analysis. There's a story in Sherlock Holmes and the Dancing Men, which illustrates how frequency analysis works. There was a need for Enigma because Blitzkrieg, the German, particularly the cavalry, the tanks had to move very quickly. And so radio is the way to go rather than signals, flags or anything like that. But the inherent nature of radio is that it's insecure. So Enigma was devised or used by the German army and the Air Force and the Navy to hide what they were saying to one another. It was actually developed by a guy called Walter Scherbius in 1918. At one stage, banks were using it. So here we are at Bletchley Park, and to give you an idea of where it is, it's pretty much halfway between Oxford and Cambridge, and that's where the clever people were. And here's the machine itself saying hello. It's lightweight, it's battery operated. It doesn't really matter so much if it gets captured, because if you don't know the settings that have been set by the machine, then it doesn't matter. But the important thing to consider is the encipherment must be exactly the same as the decipherment, or rather decipherment should be the same as the encipherment. If you don't match up the settings, then it's not going to work. And the messages will be sent by Morse code. And these are the bits. You got at the front the so-called stecker board, the plug board. The keyboard looks a little bit like a typewriter, except they used QWERTZ rather than QWERTY. The output lamps, the rotors themselves, the wheels, the reflector, the battery box, and then the rest of it is pretty straightforward. Essentially what you would do is you would press one of those keys, and I'll show you on the electrical wiring how it would zoom in around. That's what the rotors look like themselves. In this case, it's a 3-rotor setup. And the thing that was interesting about this machine was that each time you press the key, the right-hand rotor would move. And eventually it would go around so many times, and then the middle rotor would move, and that would go around, and then eventually the left-hand rotor would move. And here's the plug board. They had an opportunity to put 10 of 13 cables in there. The electrical wiring, press the key, the wires go all the way through the various rotors, the wiring inside the rotors, to the reflector, back again, through the plug board, or it may be wrong, it may be the plug board first and then goes through the rotors, but eventually it will light up a lamp, and the assistant operator would have to write down what that letter is represented by the lamp. I should say in the rotors that it's rather like the car's odometer readings as you go through the mileage, the bits turn over. As far as the rotors are concerned, the Army and the Luftwaffe used 3 out of 5. The Navy took it a lot more seriously, and they had 3 out of 8. And in February 42, the Navy added a 4th rotor, and Bletchley Park was shut out for months, from February of 42 to October, until HMS Petard drove U-boat 559 to the surface. And I'll tell you that story, I think. So the idea behind it is that's an awfully big number. So if you wanted to try what they call brute force, it would take centuries, and by which time the information would be redundant. As it says, this coupled with the frequency of changes, which was every 24 hours, usually at midnight, led the Germans to believe Enigma was unbreakable, which led me to the idea that maybe the reason that they were kind of sloppy with the way they used the machine was because they believed it was unbreakable anyway. So you get hold of the code book, the operator gets hold of the code book and chooses the rotors that were assigned, and then the setting was assigned as well, and the plug board, the stacker, is assigned, and then the operator chooses 3 letters at random. But the thing was that humans aren't random, and I believe, and maybe somebody could confirm this, because the problem was that the operators tended not to use randomness. They would start choosing their own particular ideas, like it might be BERLIN or something like that. You get into it. So the receiving operator sets RNF and types in BTA. Oh, did I? Okay. It's encoded, it becomes BTK and gets written down. The operator sends a message sending on unclear without being coded. RNF is unclear, and BKT, which is the encoded version. Settings would change frequently, but one of the most important things, and it was a very big weakness with Enigma, was no letter could be the same as itself. That was the way the machine was set up. The Poles got hold of a commercial Enigma in 1928. Like I say, in the 1920s, Poland had been recreated from the German Empire and the Russian Empire. So they had people on either side that didn't like them. In fact, the Poles had had a war with the Soviet Union. Mathematically, they determined that there was characteristics of Enigma at the time. And I think it had something to do with the chains, in the sense that letter A could go to D, could go to J, to go back again. They created a thing they called a bombi, which was like 6 enigmas, and it was used to break the code. And I think at that time, Germany was changing their settings once a month, but once they started changing it more often, that was the end of their ability. But the Poles had already had a pretty good idea of what Enigma was like. And I don't know whether I should include this now, but I want to, in case I forget. Hans Hilo Schmidt was the brother of a senior officer in the German army. And in 1931, he went to the French embassy and said, I've got something that you might like. And he produced information about how Enigma works. And they called him Agent Ash. So now the Poles and the French are checking out Enigma. I think at that time the British weren't necessarily involved, but later on they got together, and I think they met somewhere in Poland. And the irony of it, I don't know when I should include this, but they had to figure out a language that they could communicate with one another, make a guess as to which language it was that French, British, and Polish people spoke. So a bunch of people showed up at Bletchley Park, and people would say, well, who are they? Oh, that's just Captain Ridley's shooting party. And at the time, they were looking for people who spoke German, like crossword puzzles. One of the more famous cryptologists, cryptanalysts, was a guy called Dilly Knox, and he was a papyrist, I guess. He was very interested to hieroglyphics. This is Marian Rejewski, one of the Polish mathematicians. And this is Alan Maitland Turing. So that was the thing about, I missed the important things as well. It wasn't just Alan Turing, it was Dilly Knox, Gordon Welshman, a lot of other people were involved in code braiding. His idea, I don't think he really knew how to build something like a computer, but the essential principle was to create a single machine that can be turned to any well-defined task by being supplied with the appropriate program. This is what they called a pinch. 559 was risen to the surface in October 30th after being depth charged by petard for 10 hours. Can you imagine what it'd be like in that submarine for 10 hours? And they weren't sure whether it was sinking or not. It was still afloat. And 3 sailors went on board the sinking machine and retrieved the code books needed to break the Shark U-boat system. That was when they went to the four-rotor. The boat sank and it took 2 British sailors with it. This is the bomb. It's designed by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, inspired by the Polish bomber. It's the equivalent of 36 Enigmas. It was set up nearly entirely by women. In Britain, they were called the Women's Royal Navy Service, also known as WRENs, who had no idea what Enigma was. They just set up the machines and based on a menu that had been created. And it was kept secret until the 1970s. And they had plugs and drums that were the ones that had to be set up. It was hot and noisy. And one guy claimed that he happened to run into a room where the WRENs were setting up the bombs and they were down to their underwear. They all had to sign the Official Secrets Act. And several women have said that they never spoke until the 1970s, that their husbands had no idea what they'd been doing. Their parents died without ever knowing what they did. Predictability. What they wanted was for the Germans to be predictable about their settings and the messages themselves. They use the term sillies. I don't think anybody's entirely sure where that came from. It may be from a German operator's girlfriend. And this gentleman, Herreville at Bletchley Park, had a dream, and he woke up after a dream and said, well, what if the operator isn't actually changing the rotors as he's supposed to? Maybe he's tired or he's overworked or the heat of battle. Maybe he just leaves the rotors as they are. Kisses were when they, Bletchley had already broken a network, say the railway or something like that. But it's the same message, or they're hoping it's the same message. There's a fair amount of it was trying to figure out what the guesses, essentially, as to what the message might be. And there's a fair amount, I think, of predictability is probably the right word, is that they had different ways or protocols of sending messages. But here's the thing, though. Once you've got the information, what are you going to do with it? Because one of the things you definitely want to avoid is the Germans figuring out that you're reading their messages. So the system was set up called Ultra, and only so many people were given the secrets. But the British also had to come up with something, because otherwise nobody would believe them. Some generals or admirals would say, oh no, this is dubious, I don't believe this. So they created this source, Boniface, which was a name given to a network of agents within the Axis countries, and they're the ones who are giving the information. The other thing you can try to avoid as well, making it too obvious, is if you happen to know as a result of breaking Enigma that a convoy, say, is leaving Italy to go to North Africa to support Rommel, you know it's there, but you have to look like it's been accidentally found. You could send an Allied aircraft who just accidentally happens to find the convoy. That way, The Germans aren't necessarily aware that their messages are being read. And now we get to Alan Turing. He was living in Wilmslow in Cheshire, which is where I'm from. And he reported a burglary. This was in 1952. And he reported it to the police. And two detectives came out to see him, Detective Sergeant Rimmer and Detective Constable Wills. And I mention their names because they worked for my dad. My father retired as a deputy chief constable. And innocently, I actually met Mr. Rimmer, but I knew nothing about Enigma because that was just a kid. And this was before anybody was able to talk about it. And as a result of the conversation of the burglary, it transpired. Well, actually, I think what happened was there was a guy called Arnold who said that he'd been having an affair with Alan Turing. And then the police came to see him. I think they kind of forgot about the burglary because the law at the time was against homosexuality. And you could get up to 2 years in prison for it. And now Alan Turing, what does that say? Wrote his keys and the something board. I forgot the name. Okay. He's now on the £50 note, and he did get a pardon eventually. And in Professor Andrew Hodges' book, Alan Turing, the Enigma, that they used to make the imitation game, this is a quote from his book. He says, "The officers seemed to be impressed by Alan's honesty, candor, and geniality, traits that also endeared him to his friends. A very honorable man, the detectives thought him as they cautioned him the usual way. And they were more impressed when he volunteered a statement of 5 handwritten pages. I mean, he made it easy for them. Relieved of the usual necessity to translate human life into police language, they were most appreciative of what was a lovely statement, written in a flowing style, almost like prose, although beyond them in some of its phraseology. They were particularly struck by his absence of shame. He never thought that he'd really broken the law." They referred to his brother was John Turing, and his son is Sir Dermot Turing, who's given talks on Enigma and Bletchley Park and the significance of the Poles and the French. One lady, when we were talking about this before, asked me to emphasize the role of women. Up to 9,000 people at one stage were working at Bletchley Park, 3 shifts of 3,000 each. And 75% of them were women. One of the things they did was like a database, a compiled card index. For example, who is Bruno Schmidt? He's a rocket guy. His knee's been moved. Why would they do that? By 1944, Bletchley Park was decoding 3,000 messages per day. And the women were all sorts. Dilly Knox chose women because they were good at it. They were known colloquially as Dillies, Fillies. And some of the women were Debs, debutantes, and they were there with their pearls. One woman in a quote said, this is Sarah Baring, she said, "I lost an awful lot of friends." And she said, "Women hate because they don't have to do the shooting." And there's a lovely story about a woman called Mavis Bailey. And she was reading an Italian Enigma message, and she realized that there were no letter L's in it. So as a result of the way the machine was that it couldn't encode itself. She knew that the operator had just been pressing, it was a dummy message, but he'd just been pressing the letter L. And she said at the time, she'd been studying the German poets in London at university. But then she said she realized the German poets would be dropping bombs on them. It was cold, when they went in with the bombs. It was terrible food. They weren't allowed to talk to anyone. They took the Official Secrets Act very seriously. Like I said, they never told their parents, husbands, who died without what their wives had been doing. And then I think in the 70s, a guy called Winterbottom, I think he wrote a book called The Ultra Secret. And then people said, oh, really? And women would say, oh, yeah, I was doing that, much to the astonishment of their grandkids. And another question I'd throw out is the grandmother of one member of the royal family worked at Bletchley. Can you guess who it is? Oh, it's gone again. Eesh. It keeps bringing up some language thing, which is annoying. Anyway, I'm almost done. One book that was recommended by Vera in San Diego Mensa is called The Rose Code novel, and you might want to read that. I have a copy. It was very, very good, about 3 women as members of the staff in oh, I see. Yeah, spam risk. When you bring this poll up, I think it messes up my sharing. I'm not sure. Anyway, funny story. American cryptanalysts arrived from a supposedly neutral country, and they were described, their cover was that they were pigeon experts, and they didn't like British food. There wasn't a lot of it around, and one of the things that they got to eat and hated it was mutton and Brussels sprouts, particularly the way my mother used to cook Brussels sprouts until they were dead. There's a funny story about a colonel of a US Army Air Corps squadron or a wing. And he says, boys, if you have to crash land when you're coming back to England, make sure it's on a Brussels sprouts field. I wanted to show a map. And I can't.
We are seeing your screen. I don't know if you are.
But yeah, I got back to it. Yeah, I don't know whether it has something to do with when you put that survey up. I don't know. Anyway, one of the suggestions is that Overlord, the Normandy invasion, succeeded because by reading Enigma messages, they knew that Hitler had kept the reserves up towards the Pas-de-Calais, which is very, very close to Dover. In fact, Dover to the Pas-de-Calais is 20 miles. So if you could imagine, Long Beach to Catalina is 26 miles. They knew from Bletchley Park that Hitler believed that Pas-de-Calais was where the real invasion would take place. And he kept his reserves there. They also they created rubber tanks, and then they kept Patton in the so-called First Army Group around the southeast of England. And the other thing you might want to consider is if Bletchley Park had not been successful in helping to get Germany to surrender, maybe the first atomic bomb would have been dropped on Berlin rather than Japan.
A grandmother of one of the current royal family actually worked on Enigma. And the question was, which one was it?
Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales, aka Kate Middleton.
So we do have quite a few questions. Let me ask, was interested, how did they get the codes for the next day, for the next 24 hours? How did they know what to change it to?
Right, and I'm glad you asked me about that, because I think there's something that I missed out. Was that was the thing about the 599 was by grabbing the code books, because you're absolutely right. But the point is that they're going to be gone for a while, and that was also the case with the weather ships. And so the weather ships were vulnerable to this, because if you can grab the code books, they're probably good for at least a month, I think. I'm trying to remember how long they would be. But that's what they were after. And so when those two sailors went into the sinking submarine to grab the books, they were able to bring them out before the submarine sank. So at one stage, I think I gave a slide of a little bit of a code book, which showed the rotors, the position that they should be in, the initial settings, and also the plug board settings. But other than that, the settings that the operators came up with were supposed to be at random. But the problem is that human beings aren't random. So they tended to use things which were somewhat predictable. That it may be, was it laziness, or because they had it drummed into them that the machine was unbreakable? Does that answer the question?
I think it does. And you're talking about what humans expect, and I know one of the things that I read is they expect E to be a fairly common letter, and you hardly ever use Z. And one of the operators who was pulling up what the letters would be, said, oh, it's too many Z's, right? Not enough E's, and would throw the letter back. So it wasn't particularly random.
The thing about frequency analysis was that if you look at, say, the Dancing Man, the Holmes story, that's exactly what happened. I think the letter E was like 11%. And so if you could probably guess as to which one's the letter E, because there's quite a bunch of them. But with Enigma, it changed. The rotor turned. So you might press the letter E once and it comes up with a J. You press the letter E again and it might come up with a P, to try to defeat frequency analysis.
Okay. You told me you talked about, I think, a German U-boat that used to send the same message every day, and
oh yeah,
decode it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there was a guy in North Africa, and he used to send every day, nothing to report. And so the funny story was, for God's sake, leave this guy alone.
I just was in England about a month and a half, 2 months ago, and I took a visit out to Bletchley Park, the Bletchley Park Museum.
And there are a lot of videos and articles. I'm sorry, who's that? Enigma.
This was Richard.
One I would recommend is called Station X.
And I was just saying, I just visited Bletchley Park about a month ago. And it's quite fascinating. They have exhibited machines. They have a working model of one of the bomb machines. They have a lot of exhibits on how they operate, what they did. They have Alan Turing's office reconstruct left just the way he left it. So it's about an hour train ride out of London. So if anybody ever gets to England, it's well worth going to see.
My visit to Bletchley was a little unfortunate because my American wife fell over at Burger King, and I had to find a general hospital.
What's the part of the Enigma machine where there are some of the cords that can change the letters? It was the something board. You could like attach a cord in there, and then you could attach it to another cord. So that way when you typed one key, it would come out as the other key.
Carlin was trying to discuss. I think he was trying to bring us back to the Steckerbrett, which was identified in the Enigma picture or schematic that was early in the
Oh, okay.
Yes. I also watched a video on YouTube. It was called Jared Owen, where he broke down the parts of an Enigma machine. And one of the parts were the board, where you could put a cord in one slot of the Enigma machine. There was still another end of the cord. You could put it in another letter. For example, O to K. So, for example, if you typed the letter O, the letter K would light up. And then if you didn't put, and then, for example, if you didn't put a chord in the letter O, if you type the key O, O would light up.
I think you might be referring to the switchboard or the stacker board, where they would plug it in. It's like it's 10 out of 13 cables.
Yes.
And that was included in the code book as to how you're supposed to set it up.
Yeah, I forgot the name of this. The stacker board?
Yeah, it's the plug board. In German, it was called the stacker board.
My question has to do with something I read a few years ago, and that was that the Poles had actually cracked the Enigma code before Germany invaded them. Is there any truth to this?
Yes. Yeah, I think in the early part of the 30s, Marian Rejewski and two others, I don't remember their names, were working on it. They had their own system. I think it was tied in with Rejewski's permutation theory. And then also, I think they had sheets that they were using and maybe rodding. There was a system whereby they were able to read the messages.
But they actually cracked the code.
Yeah, that was the trip that Dilly Knox and somebody else did to Poland. And that was what I thought was funny, that they should talk. The only language that they could communicate with one another was the language of their enemy. And that's when they got together and shared information. Initially, they were very suspicious, because I guess one of the issues with once you started breaking somebody's code is you don't want them to know. So you worry about the security of it, that somebody might leak it. And before you know it, the Germans may have changed the system altogether.
But they actually cracked the code.
Yes.
And part of the story I had read, they actually handed the cracked code over to the French and the British.
Yeah, that was the trip that Dilly Knox and somebody else did to Poland. And that was what I thought was funny, that they should talk. The only language that they could communicate with one another was the language of their enemy. And that's when they got together and shared information. Initially, they were very suspicious, because I guess one of the issues with once you started breaking somebody's code is you don't want them to know. So you worry about the security of it, that somebody might leak it. And before you know it, the Germans may have changed the system altogether.
Well, that's great. Thank you for confirming that. The other thing I'd heard is that the Enigma machine was actually patented so that the actual schematics were kind of like public knowledge. Have you heard anything like that?
There's a patent in Britain. Because Shobius, it wasn't intended to be a military device. It was used by banks and other people like that. It was only later on that the Germans got hold of it and realized that it could be used, particularly with blitzkrieg.
Yeah, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, is that the machine that the Poles had, it was used by bankers, was quite a bit less complicated, and that when the Germans used it, they actually made it somewhat more, more coded.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this, that the Bombi, I think the Poles called it, was the equivalent of about 6 Enigmas, whereas the bomb was 36. Dan has said, didn't the sailors also bring a 4-rotor machine out of the submarine? I heard a story, and I don't know why that occurred, was they found 3 rotors in one sailor's clothing. Now, wasn't he supposed to just drop it into the ocean? But I guess he didn't. But I tried to find out where I'd seen that, and I don't remember. But that's the only thing I can think of. But essentially, they did bring out Enigma machines out of the submarine. Whether or not they were 3 rotors or 4 rotors, I don't know. Also, Dan asked about the National Cash Register, which I love the story, because eventually the Americans said, look, we want to help. We also want to be in on the act. And so the design of the bomb was used, and Americans had a lot more resources, and they were building these machines at the National Cash Register in Dayton, Ohio. The other thing that I had to look up as well, because I thought, Well, how did they send all the Morse over to America? Well, they had transatlantic cables.
Yes, I have a version of the most frequent letters used. I think there are several versions in the frequency. That's the version that I'm used to. It's ETAOINSHRTLU. It's the frequency of letters. He was Jim was referring to
Yeah, HA is referring to the letter frequencies, and I believe the list you did was ETA Edoin Shridlu. But yeah, there's a couple different variants of that, and basically E being first and T being second to see.
The thing about frequency analysis was that if you look at, say, the Dancing Man, the home story, that's exactly what happened. I think the letter E is like 11%. And so if you could probably guess as to which one's the letter E, because there's quite a bunch of them. But with Enigma, it changed. The rotor turned. So you might press the letter E once and it comes up with a J. You press the letter E again and it might come up with a P to try to defeat frequency analysis.
Okay. You told me you talked about, I think, a German U-boat that used to send the same message every day. And
oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there was a guy in North Africa, and he used to send every day, nothing to report. And so the funny story was, for God's sake, leave this guy alone.
My question has to do with something I read a few years ago, and that was that the Poles had actually cracked the Enigma code before Germany invaded them. Is there any truth to this?
Yes. Yeah, I think in the early part of the 30s, Marian Rejewski and two others, I don't remember their names, were working on it. They had their own system. I think it was tied in with Rejewski's permutation theory. And then also, I think they had sheets that they were using and maybe rodding. There was a system whereby they were able to read the messages.
But they actually cracked the code.
Yeah, that was the trip that Dilly Knox and somebody else did to Poland. And that was what I thought was funny, that they should talk. The only language that they could communicate with one another was the language of their enemy. And that's when they got together and shared information. Initially, they were very suspicious, because I guess one of the issues with once you started breaking somebody's code is you don't want them to know. So you worry about the security of it, that somebody might leak it. And before you know it, the Germans may have changed the system altogether.
And part of the story I had read, they actually handed the cracked code over to the French and the British.
Yeah, that was the trip that Dilly Knox and somebody else did to Poland. And that was what I thought was funny, that they should talk. The only language that they could communicate with one another was the language of their enemy. And that's when they got together and shared information. Initially, they were very suspicious, because I guess one of the issues with once you started breaking somebody's code is you don't want them to know. So you worry about the security of it, that somebody might leak it. And before you know it, the Germans may have changed the system altogether.
Well, that's great. Thank you for confirming that. The other thing I'd heard is that the Enigma machine was actually patented so that the actual schematics were kind of like public knowledge. Have you heard anything like that?
There's a patent in Britain. Because Shobius, it wasn't intended to be a military device. It was used by banks and other people like that. It was only later on that the Germans got hold of it and realized that it could be used, particularly with blitzkrieg.
Yeah, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, is that the machine that the Poles had, it was used by bankers, was quite a bit less complicated, and that when the Germans used it, they actually made it somewhat more, more coded. Somebody else asked about any books that you can recommend.
And there are a lot of videos and articles about Enigma. One I would recommend is called Station X. which is a 4-part series. The one that the imitation game was loosely based on was called Alan Turing, the Enigma by Professor Andrew Hodges. But I should warn you that it's nearly 700 pages.
I am going to recommend a fiction book that I think kind of said a lot about Enigma. It's called Cryptomonicon, and it's by Neil Stevenson. It talks about things that are happening today, and then has another section that talks about what their fathers were doing during the war. And he was a cryptoanalyst, and it tells a lot about the Enigma. We are at the end of our time. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Hope to see everybody next year.